we live in a world that is racked with stress. I mean, that is just kind of a reality of the culture and the times in which we live. I mean, there's so many things that you have to be responsible for, so many things that you have to do. Sometimes I think that we're racked with stress because we are so overwhelmingly blessed, and as a result of that, whenever we experience things that really were far more common many years ago and many generations back, we end up actually experiencing those things so much harder. And it's just because the relative floor of things we're having to deal with, seems like it's so much lower. Things like loss, things like death, things like tragedy are things that we are so insulated from. We are so immensely blessed to live in the time period that we are, despite all the rhetoric and things people like to say. And as a result of that, when something truly bad happens, sometimes we find ourselves incapable of dealing with it. I think that when those times happen, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like something where the stress and the burden of what we're having to deal with is more than we can possibly stand. And in doing that, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that God did not intend for His creation to be this way. In fact, when you look at God's creation, you can sit here and see that, in Genesis 1, what we have recorded is that God created the earth in different steps, right? That it says, in day 1 He created this, day 2 He created this, day 3 He created this, all the way through day 6. And then once He hit day 7, He rested. This is interesting because you end up seeing this kind of connection with God and Him admiring His creation and the concept of rest. And you actually see this recreated when God is giving instruction to His chosen people when they're brought out of bondage from Egypt. You'll read this here in a second, but you end up seeing this interesting interaction where, God's people are told to work, to get the food that God has provided for them for 6 days, but then on that 6th day, gather twice as much as you normally need, because on the 7th I want you to rest. And it's really being given in such a way that maybe the Hebrew people didn't really understand that that it was a blessing. It almost to them seemed like a restriction, because these are people who just came out of slavery in Egypt, so they didn't understand the concept of I'm entitled to rest. But God knew that rest was something He intended for them. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think that sometimes when we are experiencing stresses in life, we end up convincing ourselves that we have to dwell in that stress, that we have to dwell in that tragedy, or we have to dwell in that misery that we're experiencing, that we have to experience it, and that we have to work through it. And in doing that, we end up focusing so much on the we, that we forget the fact that God has intended for something better, that He wants us to be able to experience joy and peace and contentment in our lives. And things like stress, things like tragedy, things like loss are things that can rob us of that peace and contentment. And because of that, it is important for us to remember that sometimes we have to make a deliberate effort in order to pursue the type of peace that God wants for us. And why? Because as we saw God do on the 7th day, God rested and admired His creation. And in the same way, when we rest, we have an opportunity to stop focusing on the things that we feel are tragedies in our lives, and instead pause to realize exactly how good God continues to be in our lives, even in the midst of our trials. Whenever we're sitting here and we're talking about these feelings of despair, these feelings of sorrow that oftentimes we end up having to deal with in our lives, you have to talk about Psalms. And the reason why is because David experienced and documented the full gambit of emotions that so often we go through. I mean, this is an individual who was a man after God's own heart, and yet despite that, he did horrible sin. I mean, he made tremendously bad choices and decisions that impacted and hurt, sometimes killed the people around him. So he experienced these victories, these tremendous emotional and spiritual highs, and then he also experienced these horrendous spiritual lows. And yet, David constantly is experiencing these different trials and then finding God's goodness in the midst of all of it. There's actually a series of Psalms that are called the penitential Psalms. And what they do is they go through and you can kind of see David's heart processing these different trials and these different, negative emotions that he's feeling, and then seeing in the midst of all of that how God is remaining faithful and how God's promise still remains true. The first one is one that's in Psalm 6. It's pretty short, so I wanted to read it, but then you'll read a different one in your groups. And it starts out saying this: Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger. Don't discipline me in the heat of your fury. Be gracious to me, Lord, because I am withering away. Heal me, O God, because my bones are shaking. I'm completely terrified in you, Lord. How long? I'm just stopping right there and thinking about that. That is so tremendously relatable. This idea of crying out to God and just saying, God, I am experiencing this. How long do I have to go through this trial? How long do I have to deal with all this? You know, sometimes that length is prolonged even more when we trick ourselves into thinking that, like, well, what did I do to deserve this? What did this other person do to deserve this? We'll sit here and get so wrapped up in our own circumstances that we'll start seeing those circumstances as being the thing that's with me all the time instead of God's presence. And then when that happens, God can feel very far away and very, very silent. As we continue on in verse 4, it says, come back, O Lord, and rescue me. Save me for the sake of your grace, for in death no one remembers you. In the depths of hell, who will praise you? I am worn out with groaning all night. I drench my bed with tears, flooding my couch till it swims. My vision is darkened with anger. It grows weak because of all my foes. Who is that's not relatable to? I mean, the idea of just being so consumed by whatever is weighing down your soul that you just can't see any way out of it. And you can see David just crying out. I mean, just full-bore emotion into whatever he is dealing with, into the fact that he is being pursued by his enemies and that he fears for his life. And that's when David picks this up once again. In verse 8, it says, get away from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my pleading. The Lord will accept my prayer. That is such a tremendously powerful thought right there, to realize that the God of all things, who controls all things, who is bigger than your circumstances, has certainly been bigger than other people's circumstances that are probably way worse than whatever I'm experiencing, that God doesn't just idly sit by and observe me in my misery, but that God actually hears my prayers, that he hears my pleading, that God loves you so much that he will listen to you, and that he would account for that he would, would acknowledge and give you hope. That is a part of whatever plan that he is unfolding. I mean, that is just tremendous. In verse 10, all my enemies will be confounded, completely terrified, and they will turn back and be suddenly put to shame. I mean, this is incredibly powerful stuff that you see in here. And once again, it's incredibly relatable because it's something that we all have to deal with in our lives. Now, you guys are going to sit here and you're going to read chapter 51, so I don't want to sit here and go through too much of it, but I'll tell you right now, this is the one that strikes me, because this is the one that starts getting into, the idea that you're just racked by your own guilt and sin. I mean, it's the thing I know I have struggled with in my life, just that guilt of sin, and then, feeling like you're constantly falling down and you're not doing good enough and you can't earn your way into God's good graces. And, especially if you grew up, with any kind of strong sense of religion, then you might look at that and sit here and, fall into a very similar trap of just saying, like, gosh, how can God love me? Not just after what I've done, but after who I continue to be, after the mistakes I've made, the people I've hurt. How can God ever have redemption on me? And so what you end up reading in here in verse 4 is, it says, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil from your perspective, so that you are right in accusing me and justified in passing sentence. True, I was born guilty, was a sinner from the moment my mother conceived me. Still, you want truth in the inner person, so make me know wisdom in my inmost heart. When you end up going through this whole thing, to me, the part that hit me the most, and hopefully what you guys will discuss, what in this hits you the most, is this thing you start seeing in the last few verses where it says, for you don't want sacrifices, or I would give them. You don't take pleasure in burning offerings. My sacrifice to God is a broken spirit. God, you won't spurn a broken, chastened heart. It's good that God is willing to accept a broken spirit more than a sacrifice. Because we all know that sometimes a broken spirit is really all you have left. When you consider the end of that section in Psalm 6 that we talked about just a moment ago, where it talks about the fact that God hears our prayers, that is something that we have to have faith in. You know, we have to internalize that as we go through these different trials in life, because that relatability is a big part of what helps us realize that God has not left us. God has not abandoned us, that He is right there in the midst of us, you know, mourning with us in a very real sense. Something that you see Jesus Christ Himself do on this earth is you see Him weep at the human condition. You see Him weep when He realizes that Lazarus has passed away. The fact that Lazarus, his friend, had to die, and that was an inevitability as a part of being a human being in this fallen world. And Christ Himself wept. You see Christ weeping when He stares out at the city of Jerusalem, and he contemplates what is going to happen to the city, and He contemplates the condition of Jerusalem, the brokenness. That is an incredibly profound moment in Christianity, and it's something that makes our God so unbelievably compassionate, to understand that He doesn't just observe us as we go through our different paces in life, that He does love us, that He does have compassion on us. But it's with that knowledge that we should understand that even as we go through different trials in life, that our God is still there, that God is still faithful, that even though we may be experiencing, you know, something that is horrible in the here and now, or even though we know something horrible may be coming, or we fear that something horrible may be coming down the pipeline, that God is there, and He is just as good in those moments as He is in the moments when we feel like we're on top of the world. We're all going to have to deal with stress. We're all going to have to deal with sorrow. We're all going to have to deal with loss and all kinds of different negative things. There's no use in ignoring it or running away from it. But as we sit here and we determine how we are going to navigate those situations, we mustn't forget the fact that we have a loving God that goes through those events with us. And He is there to help us carry our burden so that we can see that there is something that is bigger and more glorious, something that we can find peace and contentment in, that is bigger than whatever our circumstances may be. There is rest even in the midst of life's most stressing moments. That's our lesson that I have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.